4 million pounds. Just let that number sink in for a second, right? Back in 1767, this staggering figure was the actual annual demand the British government handed down to the East India Company. And the crazy part? That was just a 10% cut of the unimaginable wealth the company was pulling out at the time. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're looking at the ultimate corporate taming. We're going to see how the sheer scale of this initial runaway greed actually forced the series of legal crackdowns that, completely by accident, ended up changing the entire course of history. Our focus today is, well, it's essentially a 160-year historical thriller, The Corporate Taming to Democratic Blueprint, Indian Governance from 1773 to 1935. We're going to explore how an out-of-control mega-corporate giant was slowly but surely brought to heel by the British Parliament. And the ultimate irony here, while trying to regulate a rogue trading company, they painstakingly and inadvertently built the incredibly complex administrative state that laid the very groundwork for modern Indian governance. To make sense of this massive evolution, we've broken it down into 4 distinct eras. First up, company rule. Second, crown rule. Third, Indian representation. And finally, the civil service. Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1, company rule, or as I like to call it, the rogue corporate giant. To really understand why Parliament was basically forced to step in and crack down on their own rogue corporation, you just have to look at the absolute absurdity of the dual system operating in Bengal between 1765 and 1772. It was wild. You had the East India Company holding literally all the financial and military power, but taking zero responsibility for the actual day-to-day administration. On the flip side, you had local Indian representatives who carried the entire burden of governing but had absolutely no power or resources to do it. It was a complete disaster. It led to extreme corruption, severe exploitation of farmers, and ultimately it forced the British government's hand. And that brings us to the very first major interventions, the 1773 Regulating Act and the 1784 Pitt's India Act. These were absolute game changers. For the first time ever, the political role of the company was openly acknowledged. They set up a Supreme Court and introduced a dual system of control directly from London. So the main takeaway here is that through these acts, this sprawling, independent megacorporation was effectively downgraded. It became a subordinate department of the British state. The political reins were finally pulling back on that raw commercial power. After those initial acts, a really fascinating pattern starts to emerge. Think of the Charter Acts passed between 1793 and 1853 as basically 20-year corporate lease renewals. Every 2 decades, the company had to go back to Parliament, and every single time their monopoly was chipped away just a little bit more. By the time we hit the 1833 renewal, total administrative and financial centralization was locked in. The East India Company was completely stripped of its commercial privileges and transformed into a purely administrative body. Moving right along to Part 2, Crown Rule and the absolute rise of the empire. So the catalyst for the next complete overhaul was the Better Government of India Act in 1858. Remember that messy dual system of control we just talked about? Gone. Completely abolished. Absolute power was shifted directly into the hands of the British Crown, and it was managed by a brand new position over in London, the Secretary of State for India. Meanwhile, on the ground, the title of Governor-General got a major upgrade to Viceroy, making them the direct, personal representative of the Crown. The whole pretense of a trading company was dropped. The corporation was out, and the empire was officially in. The next huge leap in administrative structure happens a few years later, in 1861, when Lord Canning introduced the portfolio system. Instead of a chaotic council trying to micromanage everything at once, specific official heads were assigned to oversee distinct branches of the administration. Now, I know that might sound a bit mundane, but it is absolutely crucial. This exact move laid the foundation for the modern cabinet-style government we recognize today, where specific ministers are actually responsible for specific departments. All right, Part 3, the push for Indian representation. Now, what's really interesting about this next shift is seeing how growing pressure from the newly formed Indian National Congress forced a deeply reluctant change in power dynamics. We see the very first hesitant results of this in the Council's Acts of 1861 and 1892. The British administration finally started accepting unofficial Indian representatives into their councils. Now, to be clear, this was definitely not a sudden burst of democracy. These representatives had tightly controlled voices, but they were eventually given limited rights to actually discuss the budget and ask questions of the executive. So a very small crack in a very solid wall for sure, but a start nonetheless. As you'd expect, the pressure just kept building, leading to the 1909 Morley-Minto reforms. This act had a huge dual impact that's really important to look at objectively. On the one hand, it was a genuine breakthrough for representation. For the very first time, an Indian member was allowed into the Viceroy's highly exclusive executive council. But on the other hand, these reforms established separate electorates for Muslims, meaning only Muslims could vote for Muslim candidates. And that created entirely new, incredibly complex political dynamics and divisions that would deeply impact the future of the subcontinent. Fast forward another decade, and we hit the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919. This introduced the concept of diarchy. Diarchy basically means double government. It cleanly split provincial administration into two halves. You had reserved subjects, which were controlled strictly by the British governor, and transferred subjects, which were managed by Indian ministers who were actually responsible to the legislature. Yes, the system was deeply flawed and often completely unworkable in practice. But structurally speaking, it was the first concrete admission that power was eventually going to have to be transferred. All of this incredible legislative evolution eventually culminates in the massive 1935 Government of India Act. This act was incredibly comprehensive. It cleanly divided legislative powers into a federal list, a provincial list, and a concurrent list, a structure that is still highly visible today, by the way. It envisioned a vast all-India federation and, crucially, granted unprecedented provincial autonomy. 6 provinces even got bicameral legislatures, meaning 2 houses. The level of administrative independence granted here was just light years ahead of where we started. Which brings us to our final chapter, Part 4, Forging the Civil Service. Of course, none of these massive constitutional shifts could actually function without a robust machine running things behind the scenes. The British had to build a bureaucratic backbone strong enough to manage an entire subcontinent and, well, maintain their control over it. In the early days, if you recall, company officials were getting filthy rich through corruption. Governor General Cornwallis realized this had to stop immediately if the administration was going to survive. His solution was a strict professionalization of the service. He outright banned private trade for officials, bumped up their salaries significantly to remove the temptation of bribes, and strictly enforced a rule that promotions would be based entirely on seniority. It was a highly precise structural approach to killing corruption. Let's move on and see how this builds, because the evolution of how these officials were actually recruited is fascinating. In 1806, if you wanted to be a civil servant in India, you had to be trained exclusively at Haileybury College in England. It was very much a closed English club. But by 1853, the system finally shifted to an open competition based on merit. Fast forward to the 1924 Lee Commission, and we see a formal recommendation for 50-50 structural parity between Europeans and Indians in the service. The doors, once locked shut, were slowly being forced open. I want to highlight this specific quote from the 1919 Montford Reforms because it really speaks volumes. It says, "If a responsible government is to be established in India, the more Indians we can employ in the public service, the better." This wasn't just some casual observation. It marked a fundamental, monumental shift in administrative policy. It was a formal acknowledgement from the British establishment that the inevitable future of India involved self-governance, and the bureaucracy simply needed to reflect that reality. But, before those wider structural doors were officially opened, we absolutely have to recognize the individuals who broke through the walls themselves. In 1863, Satyendranath Tagore achieved an incredible milestone. He became the very first Indian to qualify for the Indian Civil Service. To fully grasp how huge this is, remember that at the time, the exams were held exclusively in London, and the syllabus was heavily biased toward classical Greek and Latin. Overcoming a system that was quite literally designed to keep him out was a monumental human achievement within this massive, rigid bureaucracy. So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. We've just traced 160 years of history where a government tried to control a remarkably greedy corporation, and later, an empire desperately tried to maintain its grip on power. Yet, looking back at all of it, we have to ask, how exactly did this rigid, deeply colonial framework of acts, reforms, and civil service rules inadvertently become the complex blueprint for the world's largest modern democracy? It's a pretty incredible testament to how the mechanics of control can, sometimes, build the very foundation of eventual self-rule. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I hope it gives you a completely new perspective on how modern governance is actually forged.